Welcome to the 16th edition of the Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, Banega Swasth India at the front lawn. We are delighted to introduce the next session, 15 Judgments, Cases that Shaped India's Financial Landscape. Saurabh Kirpal in conversation with Tripurdaman Singh. This session will be presented by the Bank of Baroda. Senior advocate and author Saurabh Kirpal demystifies 15 major judgments and unravels the effects they have on the socio-economic history of India in 15 judgments, cases that shaped India's financial landscape. The book traces the different jurisprudential philosophies in the country since independence, including those affecting the environment, sex discrimination, disinvestment, and insolvency, to present the court's profound effect on Indian economy. In conversation with Tripurdaman Singh, our first speaker is Saurabh Kirpal. He's a senior advocate who regularly appears in matters of commercial and constitutional law. He was a lawyer in the case that led to the historic judgment on Section 377 and is currently representing couples seeking recognition of same-sex marriage before the Supreme Court. He is the editor of Sex at the Supreme Court and the author of 15 judgments, cases that shaped India's financial landscape. Our second speaker is Tripurdaman Singh. He's a British Academy postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, University of London. He's the author of Imperial Sovereignty and Local Politics, 16 Stormy Days, and most recently, Nehru. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Saurabh Kirpal in conversation with Tripurdaman Singh, 15 judgments, cases that shaped India's financial landscape.
This is such a great pleasure, Saurabh, and I can't tell you how interesting and how riveting I found the book, and especially for someone coming from a non-law background, because it demystified so much. And I really wanted to start with how and why you wrote this book, because when I first read it, I was like, it's simple and straightforward, but it's deceptively simple and straightforward, because actually it's covering like a really wide spectrum of cases, and it's a kind of whistle-stop tour through the country's jurisprudential history almost. So why did you decide to write this book?
Well, I think some part of the bio has been released already as to why I wrote this. The attempt is to demystify. I think very often the two topics I'm writing on, finance and the law, can be a bit overwhelming for the average person. I mean, they don't also sound very exciting. Law is not fun to read about. Finance is even less so. It's deathly dull for some. But yet there are no other things which affect your life so deeply. The finance and the law react and shape every aspect of your being on a daily basis. So it's very important to know about it. And I found that a lot of writing that has been done about law and about finance was fairly, it disabled people from understanding what was happening. As it is when we read judgments these days. They're prolix, they're long, incomprehensible. So there is no way a person can actually understand what the law is. So my aim was to take a historical social context, take the economic context of the time as well, give it a sense of how we were going, simplify the law, but not dumb it down. It's not a finance for idiots or finance for dummies. Mm-hmm. But it is a book which I think once you read, you will understand how the systems of both politics, law, and finance work. Because I think one of the important requirements in today's time, or indeed ever, is the need for a citizen to be fully empowered, and for that you need knowledge. You need to know what the systems are. You need to know what the law is, how it's come to be, and only then can you seek change if you think change is necessary. So the aim was to write for a lay audience, which I hope I've done.
No, I mean, it's a fantastic book, and the ability to write with that much clarity is something I envy a great deal. So now I want to come to the first case you talk about, and that's Kameshwar Singh versus the state of Bihar. Now, at one level, this is a judgment about zamindari abolition, and it's quite an innocuous judgment. When you read about it, it's quite an innocuous judgment. All they say is that, well, you can't have a kind of unequal rates of compensation, and so it's declared unconstitutional on very technical grounds of Article 14, so that it violates their right to equality. But the judgment does more than alter the financial landscape of the country. It leads pretty directly to the First Amendment, which is quite wide-ranging. So, given how innocuous the judgment was, and given why do you think it provoked such a furious reaction?
I think, again, this is an example of how you can't understand a judgment without the history of the time being considered. This is a judgment that comes in 1950. India has just gotten independence. It's a dramatically poor country. There are zamindars and there are landless laborers. The entire Constituent Assembly is filled with freedom fighters who have promised to their constituents, because they will also at some point fight elections. They have promised their constituents that we will improve your lot. You will become richer. And the one way that will happen is by taking land from the rich zamindars and distributing it. So there is this political compulsion that exists with the members of the Constituent Assembly. At the same point, maybe pandering to whatever their better ideals, I hope, they have given themselves a constitution which has a whole series of rights. Right to equality, right to freedom, all the rights we know today. But one very important right at that point is also the right to property. And all kinds of safeguards along with the right to property. Because we are now going from a laissez-faire economic system, which was there in the British times, to hopefully a Nehruvian, Fabian socialist mixed economy, where you have, of course, requirements of the directive principles, but you also have recognition that property needs to be protected. So now you have these two conflicting principles, the need to give land to the peasant and how to secure the fact that you have to give enough compensation for it. So these are mutually exclusive ideals, and inevitably, when the court did rule in favor of property rights, and you're right, technically, if you read the judgment, it's probably clearer than some of the judgments we read today. But nevertheless, it was on a very narrow point. But that was enough to completely shake up the entire political establishment. From Bihar to, of course, then UP, all states around the country, which were enacting the similar legislations at that point of time. They said, how is it possible that we will now promise and deliver this redistribution of wealth? And they felt that the courts were usurping this role. And as you've written in your brilliant book, Pandit Nehru famously said that this beautiful constitution that we have given to ourselves has been purloined by the lawyers. Because no one likes lawyers, other than their chartered accountants. They love us. But, so that was the reason this happened. And in that, of course, comes the First Amendment, where, of course, the right to property is sort of undone. But we get this black hole of an article, which is an article which says that whenever a right comes into conflict with a particular directive principle, or with a that's 31C, it's 31A and 31B are the two articles, then they will be immune from judicial scrutiny. We will put them into something called the 9th schedule, and once this law goes into the 9th schedule, it could be any law of any form, and it goes into the 9th schedule, then the courts can't look into it. And the moment the courts can't look into it, it means that you don't have any rights as far as that law is concerned. So that is a legacy which has persisted today. And I think, that is one of the reasons we as a society today don't value rights. I think that is a failing that we have, is we don't insist that our rights are implemented and we don't fight for our rights, because pretty much from the get-go, from the time our constitution is promulgated, the rights that are given to us by the people who are supposed to be safeguarding those rights are the first people to take them away. And we sat back and allowed it to happen, and we're still allowing it to happen.
No, and that quickly brings me to another case that you look at, and that is the case of bank nationalization. And what happens in bank nationalization is, again, it pits the parliament against the judiciary because the court nullifies the bank nationalization laws that have been passed. And it relies on a quite expansive reading of Part 3 of Article 19, and also, well, of course, Article 31. And in a sense, you say that it really lays down a new constitutional principle, which then allows the court a much greater sort of leverage in holding the government to account. Could you perhaps elaborate on that?
Certainly. Again, this is something I'll take you back to the politics of the time. But more than just the politics of the time, I think it's interesting also to examine how the courts at that time were thinking, because it ties in very closely to where we are in present today. I think that's something to bear in mind, that a lot of what is happening today that you read about, this friction between various states, between the executive and the court, this is an ancient feature of our constitution and our history. It persists now because it has always persisted, because it is inevitable in some way. But what do I mean by that? The bank nationalization, of course, happens because Prime Minister Indira Gandhi feels politically threatened. She has just fought with her syndicate of the Congress party. She split the Congress party and has a very narrow majority, and now wants to cement her role within government and make sure she comes back to power. This is a time when the Congress had, for the first time, started losing seats. Because after 1950, there was a hegemony of the Congress party. But by this point of time, people are tired or whatever, there's been a lack of delivery for whatever political reasons. The Congress is losing its hegemony. So Indira Gandhi now wants to ensure that she's seen as someone who's fighting for the poor. Because nothing gets votes more than fighting for the poor, as it should maybe. So she comes out with the slogan, Garibi Hatao, and part of that process is nationalization of banks. Now, I must say nationalization of banks, Tripurdaman, was needed at that point of time, because all the studies show that the capital was restricted to a few industries. It was very much an old boys network. I don't know how much has changed so far, but it certainly was at that point of time. So that is why you have an old boys bank nationalization attempt. That is then struck down by the Supreme Court. And in striking down, there are some very interesting constitutional doctrines laid down. And here we have to come to the history of the courts. Because by this point of time, a battle after the First Amendment has been building between the courts on the one hand, who say you can't just start amending the Constitution. It is our right to protect the Constitution. And on the other hand, you have Parliament, which says, no, I have the right ultimately to amend the Constitution. And in the meanwhile comes a judgment called Golaknath by Chief Justice Subbarao. And the Chief Justice in that judgment says, courts have ultimate power. No fundamental right of any citizen can ever be taken away, because that is not something that is contemplated in the Constitution at all. So there is this battle that is brewing between the courts and Parliament at this point of time. And in keeping with that judicial philosophy of expansionism and protection of their own turf, because we cannot forget that each institution is protecting its own turf at some level. So the courts lay down a principle that fundamental rights are kind of I suppose a word favorite to me, a rainbow, so to say, which is a agglomeration of rights. You can't take one right and analyze just that right. You take all the rights together and you read them together. So that's a very expansive form of enabling and empowering a citizen. Her fundamental rights are now so much wider because of that. Because the intention of the courts is to something that happened eventually in 73, which is the Kesavananta Bharati case, which is the basic structure doctrine, which is now being called into question in certain circles. The vice president, of course, recently commented about it. But the battle that is today being fought, I see, about the supremacy of parliament versus the supremacy of the courts or the supremacy of the constitution, has its roots from the First Amendment, the first judgment, and this judgment as well.
No, and that's a very interesting point about the sort of wider social and political milieu, and I'll just come to that. Of course, the government gets around this judgment by promulgating fresh legislation, but it triggers a lot of very furious political commentary, and there's, you quote Mohan Kumar Mangalam, I'm sorry, and he says, well, basically the courts are compelling the adherents of socialism to, I mean, they're forcing them to work beyond the constitution in a sense. And I'm interested in how the wider social and political milieu plays out, because you then come to a very interesting case, which is the Bangalore water supply case, which in a sense really illustrates the leftward turn that the judiciary takes, because they read they widen the use of the term industry to a huge degree, and you illustrate it by saying this, it comes to a point where even something like the Madras Gymkhana can be termed an industry, and it effectively becomes impossible to fire anyone. So there are two questions related to this. One is, how do you see the relationship between the wider political and social milieu and the law? Because, of course, we often say politics is downstream of culture. Could the same be said of the law? And the second is individual judges, because this judgment is delivered by a judge, Justice Krishna, who is a proclaimed communist. He has even been to jail. And
a minister.
And he's been a minister as well. First, about the ethics of having someone like that as a judge. And second, how much the political predilections of individual judges, really affect judgments?
I think these are very important questions. I mean, if you read the Scandinavian legal realists, they'll say that the judgment is nothing other than the biases, prejudices, and views of individual judges. But just answering your first question, that's a slightly more philosophical or a jurisprudential take on it. It's like a chicken and egg situation, really. Law and society as to, is it possible to have law which is distinct from that which is going on in society or not? And the answer is, it's probably symbiotic at some level. Law reflects what society is, because after all, you can't stray too much from what people think, want, need, and desire, because if law is to have some legitimacy, some moral legitimacy, it must comply to some extent with what people want. We can't live in a society, we don't want to ever live in a society where law is enforced by danda. Law has to be enforced because people believe that it is worthwhile following the law. And they will follow the law only if they believe it has a moral sanctity, or at least some view which is similar to what society believes in. So to that extent, yes, it is necessary for law to follow what society is. But the law is often also some kind of a cathartic thing. It brings change about in society to make it a better place, especially in our constitution, which is a very visionary, liberal, forward-looking document. It promises equality, liberty, fraternity, and these values, of course, come through the motion and means of using law to shape society going forward. So yes, there is this interaction between law and society and how that happens. But it's rare for either to stray too far from the other, because then is when friction truly starts to happen. And that neatly brings us a little segue into how judges are. And I think people misunderstand and misappreciate exactly how dependent our judgments and our laws are on views of individual justices. There are 34 judges of the Supreme Court. There are 15 benches sitting at any point of time between 2 judges and 3 judges. And we who practice in that court often laugh and say that there is not one Supreme Court of India, there are 15 Supreme Courts of India. Because depending on where your matter goes, who those 2 judges are, the outcome can be completely radically different. Some judges will have a very conservative mindset. Some will have a very liberal mindset. Some are inherently anti-government. And some are what I call sarkari judges, which are inherently pro-government. This is not party political. right? This is not an ideological belief that government is right or wrong. This is just their view. But in this, Justice Krishna Iyer is actually truly one of those most interesting people. He is someone who had gone to jail and has been said is, I think, the only person who went to the Supreme Court who had ever been jailed by his own countrymen, was, as you said, a minister in the communist government. Something that we frown upon now. If a retired Chief Justice gets something, we say, how is that possible? Well, this has been happening for a long time. This is not just Krishna Iyer. Even in Golaknath case, which I talked about earlier, Chief Justice Subbarao, who gave the judgment which struck down any attempt to amend the constitution, resigned as his office of Chief Justice of India to contest for the post of president. So this belief that somehow judges have been always apolitical and is absolutely wrong. But Justice Krishna Iyer had very strong left-wing views. And he managed to carry a 7-judge bench with him. And that's because, at this point of time, India has swung leftwards. We've had the laissez-faire view, we've had the zamindari abolition, we've had bank nationalization, we've had governments now, Indira Gandhi, knocking constantly, pulling the country to the left. And it's not surprising at this point of time that even the court does inevitably feel the heat, partly or willingly moves to the left. So Justice Krishna Iyer was an embodiment of the nature of the judges at that point of time, virtually all of whom were fairly left-wing. I think once some of the judges who gave the judgment of the bank nationalization case in Keshavanand Bharati were either resigned or were superseded. That's when the lurch to the left started.
No, and that's interesting because in the bank nationalization case, of course, you have a dissenting judgment by Justice A.N. Ray. And that, in a sense, establishes his left-wing credentials, and then he supersedes several justices to be made Chief Justice. And then he's Chief Justice at a particularly, what could be called a particularly dark period for the Indian judiciary.
Chief Justice Ray was an interesting man. He gave a judgment, of course, not only in favor of the government in the bank nationalization case. Even in Keshavanand Bharati, he dissented and said there is no such thing as the basic structure. I think he'd be a very popular judge in certain circles now. And that is what was said by Sital Bhatt about him, is the boy who wrote the best essay won first prize. So that was actually what the power of the bench and the executive was at that point of time.
So moving on from this, the Bangalore water supply case, in a sense, that judgment, unless I'm mistaken, still stands. And certain parts of it have been, I guess, read down over the years, but even that only starts in the 2000s. It starts because, as you say, the prevailing political atmosphere changes. And so this is a question that I have, which is about, you mentioned people want to follow laws because they believe there's a certain sense of moral sanctity. But there's also the greater question of social and political legitimacy. And as the prevailing winds change, you come to the Balco privatization case, where actually it kind of shows the arc that the court has moved through, because it upholds privatization and opens the gates towards the progressively the dismantling of the public sector, as much as, well, we could have had or seen. And so, is this a question of moral sanctity, or is this, you think, a question of just of political and social legitimacy? So how can you, where does moral sanctity lie in this question?
I, for one, believe that morality is not that distinct from political sanctity. I think there is a very strong link between the two. The personal is the political, is the moral, right? Especially in matters.
So here's just a question from that. So a law correctly passed through Parliament, going through the process, does that automatically grant it moral sanctity?
Well, yes and no. Yes, in as much as when law passes through Parliament, it has passed, presumably, the democratic test. It has legitimacy because the majority of the members of Parliament, who are supposed ostensibly to represent a majority of the people have voted in that favor. Of course, in a system where the first past the post exists, that need not always be the case. So there may not be democratic legitimacy, but at least there is an institutional recognition that when law passes parliament, there is moral legitimacy. It's a reflection of the democratic ideal. It is a reflection of what the Constitution promises as will of the people being reflected. So that's important, and therefore there is moral legitimacy to it. But of course, if we are in a reductionist point of view, which is that law and democracy is only majoritarianism, then I'm afraid that is not a fully fleshed out conception of democracy as envisaged under our Constitution. Because we don't believe in just rule by the majority. We believe in rule of law, and we believe, most importantly, in the rule of the Constitution of India, which guarantees minority rights, property rights, a whole host of fundamental rights, which are put in there as a recognition of the dignity of the individual, the value that each person has in themselves, but also in recognition of the fact that each of these rights will allow a citizen to accomplish those cherished goals of the preamble: equality, dignity, liberty, etc. So as long as a law which has passed through parliament does not meet with those ideals which are embodied in the Constitution, which all of us hold sacrosanct and dear. We ask people, anyone, what do you hold more dear, the Constitution or just a particular law? Obviously, we value the Constitution far more. So if a law does not pass constitutional muster or does not have compliance with the fundamental rights, that will therefore lack moral legitimacy. So when the courts step in and rule in a particular way, it may appear like a political exercise because, of course, these are judges who have not been elected. There is a lot of hoo-ha-ha about how they appoint themselves. But nevertheless, when judges give a decision, it is not their own personal view alone. Of course, it's shaped by their upbringing and politics. No person is completely free of the place where they've come from. But the idea is they are ruling in favor of, or at least in consonance with, constitutional values. So
here's another question, and it's linked to that. So the Bangalore water supply judgments, for example. Now, Parliament has passed a series of labor laws, but it has failed to notify them. Why do you think that is?
There's a labor codes which have now been notified. For the same reason why Parliament has not thought it fit to amend the law or the definition of the word industry since 1980. In the Bangalore water supply judgment, it was recognized at that point of time that the definition of industry is so wide that anyone working anywhere pretty much becomes a workman. So lawyers could be, Madras, Gymkhana, you're right, people in hospital, all workmen who can't then be fired, right? So there's a belief increasingly that because of that, there is an ossification of business and extra workmen can't be retrenched. But that's right or wrong, that's a political philosophy, we can debate that separately. But there is this feeling of disquiet that this needs to, the court has gone a bit too far and it needs to be amended. But the law is not amended in 1980 till date. For the same reason, I believe that the labor codes have not been amended or brought into force so far. It's because while often the failure to retrench people and this, as I said, ossification is felt to be a drag on the economy, we are a poor country. We cannot permit a large number of workmen to be without protection. These protections are needed. Otherwise, we can't have a hire and fire policy. So and also there's a very large constituency, political constituency for the government of workmen. They vote. They probably vote a lot more than people who are maybe richer than them. So if that be the case, there is no political benefit given or perceived by the government to amend the laws. And even if the laws are still kind of balance the right between the needs of industry and workmen, the moment you're seen as trying to tinker with labor laws, there is fear of outrage and uproar. So I suppose that is one reason. But this is more armchair politics than a lawyer is entitled to engage in.
Okay, and so I come now to again, a very pivotal case, which I guess has its important way beyond first impressions. And those are the Bhavri Devi and Vishaka cases that you talk about. And in a sense, it's a segue from this, because in a sense it's again the case themselves, the Bhavri Devi case in themselves deals with a quite brutal case of sexual assault. But the court uses it to frames it in terms of work and protection from sexual harassment at work, and it then uses the case to, of course, frame guidelines. So there are two questions from this. First, of course, how does work and the idea of a safe environment link to this case? And secondly, why is the court forced to frame guidelines? Why has it, for example, been impossible for Parliament to legislate on this matter?
First, just a little background of this case. But before that even, I've now done a bit of the circuit for this book. And this question and this chapter is almost always alluded to because people find it surprising. I know you don't, I don't. But a lot of people find it surprising that why is a chapter on sexual harassment guidelines one of those 15 judgments that shaped India's financial landscape, and almost always asked by a cis-het man, right? And to that I'll say is that unless you have lived reality of working in India as a woman, you won't understand what the value of sexual harassment guidelines are. Because you can't hope to actually improve the lot of the economy of a country if half your country feels incapable of working or unable to work. So that's the necessity, and that's the larger reason why I wrote on this chapter. But on the case actually was pretty horrific. There was a lady called Bhavri Devi who was a Sathin. She was a local government employee who was going around the villages of Rajasthan trying to tell people as to why getting child marriage was a bad idea. Now you think it's a fairly obvious thing, but people may disagree with you. So that's that. But she apparently went a step too far because she went to someone's house, an upper caste person's house, where child marriage was about to happen, and said, don't do this. Obviously now, her being from a lower caste, going to an upper caste person and telling this did not go down well, and it was thought appropriate to teach her a lesson. And how does that happen often in certain parts of this country? Is through exercise of violence against the woman. So when she was walking back home one day, shortly after going to this upper caste family, she was held down by a group of men and raped. There was a brutal gang rape. Now, of course, gang rape, horrific as it may, you try to wonder what is the connection really with sexual harassment. But that is when you realize that she was raped not only, as some women are, of course, because she's a woman from a lower caste, but because she was doing her work. Now, she was simply trying to go to people's houses and say, you cannot allow child marriages to happen, for which she's raped. Nothing happens in this case. To date, the trials are on. That's another sad statement about how our legal processes work in this country. But in spite of that, and in spite of the fact that it is recorded that companies in the country and the world do well if they have a non-toxic work culture, if they have redressal mechanisms, if they have sexual harassment guidelines at the place, they're never actually put in place. So the court, when it's confronted with the situation, doesn't have the luxury of simply saying, okay, we will commend to Parliament, please enact the law. Because Parliament till the 90s, late 90s, well, first 40 years, has not thought it fit to. And can I point out, Parliament still has not thought it fit to enact an anti-discrimination code today for a huge number of people. I mean, for women, minorities, there is no anti-discrimination law in our country. We keep on talking about Article 14. That is only against the state. But a private organization can discriminate against you. Partly because there is no political will, and partly because there is no political gain that the government feels by enacting matters which matter so much to people's lives, but because they're not a vocal block, therefore they're ignored. So I think that is one reason.
No, but of course, also, as you point out, we, unlike America, we don't have a Bill of Civil Rights. So and there's no political movement, or there seems to be no social pushback against not having a Bill of Civil Rights either. But again, this case illustrates just how far the court can go, because it frames guidelines that are still in force today in the absence of any legislation by Parliament. But it also illustrates a kind of flip-flop that the judiciary does, right? Because in some cases, as in this, it does step up. But then there are others in which it kind of takes a more hands-off approach, and you talk about this in your book as well. And so, what is the and how? Again, two questions: A, how do you see this? And B, how, in the sense of laying down a kind of path of jurisprudential evolution, how is this flip-flop justifiable?
I think I'll take those two questions posed to me and merge them once again. And I think the problem with that is the absence of judicial consistency in our country, which I think is sometimes detrimental to the rule of law. The idea of the rule of law is that I must know what the law says so I can plan my life accordingly. It must be rule of law and not law of men. And I say men deliberately because there are hardly any women in either parliament and only a few in the Supreme Court. So as long as there's an ideal of the rule of law, you would expect predictability. But sadly, I find that is lacking in our courts. And this is something we had talked of earlier, the 15 Supreme Courts that exist in our country. The discretion that is there because of the ambiguity of the law enables judges to take diametrically opposite views of what the Constitution says. Now, of course, a Constitution is always a living document. It is always slightly ambiguous because a Constitution drafted in 1950 hopefully will endure for 100, 200, 300 years. And if its words are to be set in stone and rigid, it will just collapse under its own weight. So the words are decidedly and advisedly ambiguous. But that gives the bench that much more discretion to fill in those ambiguities with their own, I wouldn't say preconceived notions, but their own ideologies, beliefs. So that is why I think there are these different judgments. But I think the problem also, and because this is true in every country around the world where there is a written constitution, it exists in the US, of course. There we've seen what has happened, Roe versus Wade being overturned, and there have been. But the kind of dramatic flip-flops we see in our country in terms of judgments being overturned is, I think, partly a consequence of the court having a very large jurisdiction and simply deciding on so many things where there is an absence of consistency, and the fact that they do not sit en banc. So in the Supreme Court in the US, all 9 judges will sit and hear all cases. In our Supreme Court, of the 34, any 2 will sit. Now, obviously, there's going to be a difference if 2 judges of one sort sit and as opposed to 2 judges of another sort. I take another example of a matter close to my heart. See the decriminalization of Section 377. We have in 2013 a judgment of 2 judges which refuses to read down 377. Yet the same Supreme Court, a few years later, unanimously overturns that judgment and says, how could we possibly have ruled like that? And history owes an apology to the country at large. Now, this is happening within the same institution. And there is no sense of how is it that this is happening. And unfortunately, I also find that there is insufficient debate on this particular schism.
No, this has been extremely enlightening, and I think we're down to our last 10 minutes, so we're going to open it out for some questions from the audience. Could we start with the lady in the front, in the red blazer, please?
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Dr. Anju Gehlot, and sir, my question is, do you think that the journey and the concept of basic structure of the Constitution is the result of a Cold War between Parliament and judiciary? And the second question is that, may I know your opinion on sologamy?
Well, I'll answer the first one because the second one is a bit out of my realm. I would say that the basic structure doctrine is not a result of the Cold War between the executive and parliament on the one hand and judiciary. It's a result of a very hot war. These were battles that were being raged in the early 70s. There's a fantastic book called Kesavananda Bharati written by Tempton Nandarajana, which deals with how Mrs. Gandhi at that point of time was trying to pack the court with judges of a certain political view, because it was anticipated that this judgment would come up. The case was making its way up the hierarchy of courts. People knew that the judgment will have to be decided, and so began an exercise in appointing judges who would be sympathetic to the point of view of the government. So this idea of the committed judiciary, the idea of intervention by the executive in how the courts function, this has always been happening. It's happening today, it has happened in the past, and it will happen as long as our court has the kind of constitutional power it has, and almost a political power. Then it is inevitable that these skirmishes or battles will happen, and therefore I would say it's the result of the hot war, yes.
Could we have the gentleman in the blue there?
Thanks for the wonderful session, sir. So my question is, do you think Indian law is always catching up with what is happening in the world intellectually, or scientifically, with what all knowledge which we have, right, in terms of evolution, evolving of the law, because of widespread institutional corruption? Instead of individual, institutional corruption is there at a very high scale than other countries. We rank very low in terms of trust in businesses and in the institutions in India. Or just because that given the structure of a democracy, that incentive mechanism has been skewed such that the smart people think there are better opportunities outside the law and just stay away from it, right? And are you optimistic about the legal system, or do you think it's going to get worse only? Because, yeah.
I think you've given me a theme for a new book, because there are multiple questions in that. As regards whether there's institutional corruption, well, I think it's common knowledge that there are corrupt individuals in our institutions. But I would not go so far as to say that there is institutional corruption per se. There is sometimes intellectual dishonesty. But then, because in our courts, I'd say that is undoubtedly a problem. But is there institutional corruption? I suppose we'll have to sit one day and examine as to what you mean by institutional corruption. But we have not lagged behind, I think, in certain areas of the law compared to the rest of the world. Because you have to ask yourself, what is the rest of the world? Is it the liberal democracies of the West? In certain areas, we've lagged behind, undoubtedly. In matters relating to finance and economics, the book that I deal with, we have lagged behind those countries tremendously. We follow the lead laid down by other countries rather than forging our own jurisprudential way forward in matters of finance. But as this discussion I hopefully has shown you, is that a decision on finance is rarely just about finance. It is also about the Constitution. It is about so many other things. And as long as that decision also concerns the Constitution, then I think we've been leaders in certain ways. The concept of the basic structure of the Constitution is something that a lot of other countries are now following up from what India decided. And in any case, I think there is no use in this one-upmanship, whether we decided, we follow people, or we have followed. We are where we are because we're in a unique space. The question is, how do we deal with it? And that takes us back to that question of institutional corruption as to what you have and my hope for it. To the extent that there is institutional corruption, I think I am very, very hopeful because histories of the countries which have had similar problems as we have in the past have shown that as the country becomes richer, its voters demand more, institutions improve. And that's the hope I have.
Thank you, sir.
Could we have the gentleman at the back? Yes.
The Constituent Assembly framed the Constitution 73 years back. How it can be binding on us now? Why can't amend the elected representative of Lok Sabha?
Well, very simple. The elected representatives also gave us the Constitution at that point of time. Of course, It was not directly elected, the Constituent Assembly, yes. But the idea is that I don't think any one of us want to live in a country where your rights are about as safe as the next election. I think all of us want to live. Yeah. I think you will find consensus amongst everybody, you may be the exception, that we all hold allegiance to our constitution. We hold it very dear. I've spoken to many people around, and there's a belief that our constitution is all right. It's the people who are running it who have let us down. And I think there is some truth in that. So a document that was given to us, I think is fairly timeless. Every time a judgment comes today which upholds the rights of people I believe in, it upholds values I believe in, I feel proud of that constitution. And I think it needs to be safeguarded today more than any time else, and it certainly does not need to be tinkered with.
Yes, the lady at the back who has her hand up. Yes. You.
You had mentioned that a lot of the judges are ideologically driven, and left-wing seems to be the more common ideology. So how is that justice? Then in my view, that's not justice. And do you as a lawyer ever call out, you know, in a subtle or a nuanced way or even openly, that a judgment is to be entirely based on the merit of the case and certainly not to be ideologically driven, whichever way it goes?
Look, I have still a legal practice to go back to, so I'm not going to say judges are purely ideological. What I'm saying is their ideologies affect their decisions, right? And why is that? That is because as long as there is an ambiguity in a word as to what it means, when you refer to Article 21 and says that you will not be deprived of your life or liberty without due process of law, what does liberty mean? What does life mean? Now, life to a person who is very wealthy means just life. Life to a person who's had to eke out a miserable existence means the ability to earn money, the ability to have healthcare, etc. So that perception of what life means will vary depending on your upbringing and hence your ideologies. But to your earlier part of your question, I don't quite think I said that the ideology is always left. Some of the judgments we discussed in some detail were the earlier judgments in our history, in our democratic history. Today, I would say the ideologies are distinctly a lot more right-wing. A lot of laws which would not have passed muster under judgments or judges who held beliefs in the 1950s and 60s are passing muster today. So there has been a swing, sort of, from the left to the right. But to this extent, will I ever tell a judge something subtly? I go back to my earlier comment. I need to earn money as well.
So that's a question about the principles of law. Now, there's a just quick follow-up question that I had to that, which is that because as you say, you talk about the 2G case, where the licenses are scrapped, and whatever one may think about the judgment, there is of course the judgment which is based, I assume, on the principles of the law, but there are wider consequences, and you mentioned about how the court doesn't take cognizance of wider consequences. Is this something you think the court should be taking cognizance of?
I think other than law school, judges must be sent to business school as well. You know, they have such a dramatic impact on the economy of this country. Look at the 2G judgment. You find that there's been a violation of how these licenses are granted, all right? But then they go ahead and cancel all these licenses. In the meanwhile, foreign companies have come into the country, bought these licenses, paid good money for it, completely unaware that their licenses and their investment would be completely made zero. So judges are trained in law. They must decide as per the constitution, as per the laws. But when you come to actually delivering a particular verdict about what are you going to do about that illegality? Now you found the illegality. You can either cancel all the licenses, or you can impose a hefty penalty. You can lay down, in the future, please don't do this, lay down guidelines. Now, when you have this range of choices that you are making, at that point of time, law alone is not a factor. And at that point, a good business acumen, or should I say common sense, I mean, I cannot say more than that, that is what's needed. but sometimes that's been lacking.
Well, I think, sorry, we're completely out of time, so we're going to have to end the session right there. But thank you very much, Saurabh, and thank you, all of you, for being here.
Thanks for all of you.
We would like to thank Saurabh Kirpal and Tripurdaman Singh for this enlightening session. Please join me in giving them a huge round of applause. Saurabh Kirpal will be signing books at the book signing desk, located on my right-hand side. Please help us in keeping the festival venues clean and dispose of your waste in the waste bins placed all across Hotel Clark's Amer. We'll begin with the next session shortly.
There